first off, before we get Ole on, I want to hit on the T1 win streak.
Yeah,
there's several things to talk about LCK right now. Obviously, like they broke their own win streak in terms of best of threes. So we're seeing this incredibly impressive one run by T1 overall.
Okay, a much more impressive actual record now when you consider the other record was the first year of LCK when the Korean Exodus happened and all the bottom teams were terrible. Dude, the bottom teams back then used to win sometimes like 1-2 series, if you remember. So like you look now, you can even see like veteran players in the bottom teams of LCK. Like, I think like the parity in LCK makes this record way more impressive, even though, yes, true, they don't have the same top level competition that sort of does sour it a tiny bit, obviously.
And also, you know, the wins against the number 2 team, Gen.G, are fraudulent. And they have had a bunch of fraudulent wins. I mean, would they have likely beaten Fredit Breon this week with their full roster?
Team might want to have played for them to win. Yes, I agree, Monte. You might need, you know, your whole team to win that game. Yeah,
they had their entire challenger team in, and yes, T1, you know, they cleaned it up. They won 2 games in 19 minutes, and that's what you expect them to do. But it's hard to take it seriously, and you know. One thing I find interesting, Thorin, is that no one in this conversation, I think people actually forgot because they're so focused. For some reason, the conversation has been around like Fnatic's undefeated best of 1 season, right? And then T1's own record in best of 3s. Literally, I have heard nobody say the following, which is that one of the other records that is very important and one in which Faker also holds.
I already know where you're going there. It's pre-OGN. It's the OGN winter, right?
It's the OGN winter in 2013, 2014, where they went 15 undefeated games. They won 5, what was it? Yeah, 15. They won all of their best of 3s in groups, and then 3 best of 5s in the playoffs. So they won 15 straight games and they won 5 consecutive best of series without dropping a game to win the title. And we don't even know where that was going because the tournament just ended, right?
Yeah.
And not only that, but they beat Samsung Ozone, which is the team that would win Worlds that same fucking year. And also 2014 then became, as we went into spring.
It did. I think they still had Dade in that final law.
Yes, they did. That was before
just before they swapped. Yeah, but they also beat KTB. They had a mega run. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, it was an incredible run that absolutely. I haven't heard anybody mentioning this whatsoever
for sure. Yeah,
because like, yeah, sure.
It should essentially have been held up. I agree, as the number 1 example of a perfect season. It's way better than the Fnatic one, for fuck's sake. Spoiler: Fnatic is only even in the regular thing. All my boys Soaz and Expect here with that Origin team took them to 5 games in the final. Like, he's talking about. The SKT also 3-0'd the final, boys. Like a fucking OGN finals. Like, yeah, that's probably the best single season by any team ever. Yeah,
exactly. And also, it was that 2014 ended up becoming the most competitive year ever in Korea, and that stands to this day because it was before any of the Korean players fucking left. It was an absolute banger of a year, and even SKT, they didn't even make it to Worlds that year after they won this tournament without dropping a game. That's how competitive things became. Also, Piglet and Mandu dropped off a cliff. Like, there were other problems, right? But this was a huge accomplishment, and Faker was literally playing in that tournament. So it is also Faker, the same player who is on this current team's accomplishment. And I just don't hear anybody talking about that whatsoever, which is a little bit mind-boggling.
There's an obvious reason. I'm just going to be a cunt now. Don't know why I'm even giving disclaimers. Spoiler, I'll be doing that a lot. But here's the cunt move, Monte. I'm just going to start ruining esports the way you all ruin it for me. So, you know, whenever I bring up, I made a great video on this last year, Monte. You know, if I was to bring up Froggen's Prime, so it's like season 2 to season 4, right? You know what everyone would say? They'd all go, oh, stop banging on about that. That's ages ago. It was a different game. But somehow Faker, season 3 to season 5, that's relevant somehow. Am I missing something? That's in the same fucking time period. How is Faker allowed to have season 3 to season 5 count for him? How is Uzi allowed to have those 2 Worlds finals count for him? But somehow, fucking old school Western players, that doesn't count. They can only be in season 9 and season 10 and season 11. What are you talking about, boys? Like, your whole career counts. So, yeah, I think it's whack when everyone just deletes history. Because that was a mad. Come to think of it, you're right. I haven't seen anyone reference that whatsoever.
And they might have, because, like, here's the thing. I'll be honest, guys. I don't watch like the LCK pre-shows. I just skip directly to the games. And so I don't necessarily and I also skip around in the games quite a bit. So it could have happened on LCK, but at least in terms of the punditry that I've heard especially surrounding the scene, that has not been an emphasis whatsoever in the conversations that have been going on. And here's another question for you before we get Ole on Thorin, because this is absolutely wild to me. We are approaching the LCK playoffs, and currently, as we saw in the T1 versus Fredit Brion game, and as we've referenced previously, there is still no rule in the LCK to allow players to compete from their team facilities. They must provide substitutes.
I know where you're going.
When going to this.
You're going to have the
Are we just going to ruin
CSGO.
playoffs? Are we just going to fucking ruin playoffs, guys?
We're about to do what we are doing in CSGO every LAN now, which is if one person pops, they're out the team. So that means, by the way, if for some reason they do a test before the final and Faker pops or Gumayushi, he's out. Now the fucking sub's in, and that's just history. Unfortunately, yeah, that isn't. I agree with you, mate. My problem is you either put the contingency that somehow it's possible to play remotely still so the competition can continue, or it has to just only be online. I think this middle ground is actually maybe worse than the positive. Because some people get to play online, great. So you get to have a crowd, great. But in history, wouldn't it be whack if, like, I mean, just think of the story already of how we've had to set up their win rate, mate. The whole win record gets sexier and sexier in reverse as you go. Well, there was no Gen G, and then of course that, and then Frederick Brion didn't even have their real, like, suddenly it becomes like, well, I mean, they did win the games though, you know, like.
But here's the thing, though.
That means the whole playoffs, essentially, we're all just doing this the whole time. The whole time for 3 weeks, please.
But it's not only that, it's also going to affect who is in playoffs, and also what the seeds are potentially, right? Like, yes. It could have already affected, Gen G seeding, for example, because they had to post the substitutes in the two matches they played against T1, where, if they win both of those, all of a sudden they're ahead of T1 in the standings, right? So there's a huge question mark here about what's going on, and especially because Korea is getting absolutely slammed by the pandemic right now. Like, their cases are through the fucking roof, and as you can see, as more and more players contracted, it is basically, it's not there's no containment in Korea right now. It's a complete mess. And so you are almost guaranteed, because of the state of the pandemic and the spread of the disease, that some members of teams in playoffs will get it in the final week, which could affect seeding or even entrance into the playoffs, or actually in the playoffs themselves, which could have a massive, massive effect. And what I don't get, again, during the pandemic, these teams were playing from their team facilities. They were playing remotely. What is preventing players from playing remotely again? This is ridiculous. This is ridiculous. There is another option. Just let teams play from home. And we know it's not even a riot policy. Like, in LCS, this past week, FlyQuest had, I think, a couple of their staff members test positive, and then the FlyQuest team just played from their facility in Los Angeles out of precaution. Like, why is this decision being made in the LCK? And again, who is in charge of this decision? Because we never see the LCK commissioner. Who the fuck is the LCK commissioner? Why do we never see statements from this person? And where is the public acknowledgement of what is going on within this league? It's embarrassing. It's fucking embarrassing.
Do you happen to, just an aside, if you don't obviously just say it, do you happen to know what the actual policy is? Like, is the logic that, like, a day or two before they play a match on stage, they have to all do a mandatory test, and then there's like because the problem I have immediately, just as someone who's been to Korea, if people don't know, Korea as a country, I know people get all butthurt, but we're talking with broad strokes here, contrasted. Like, all countries can't be identical in their behaviour. Put it this way, contrasted with where I am from, Korea is much more, I would say, unfortunately, of a hypochondriac country. If people don't know, in fact, this is what's hilarious, mate. I might be the first person to ever have a fucking interview with a Westerner with a mask on. LS was wearing one in that old fucking Reflections from, like, 2014, you remember? Because at the time he had a cold, so because he's the most, like, Korean of all the Westerns you ever meet. He was already wearing one the whole time because it was social etiquette at the time if you had a cold to wear a mask, or the flu to wear a mask. So the problem I have is this. One, I think, unfortunately, it's a country where it would essentially almost be considered dishonorable if you sort of, like, skimped on any of those aspects. You're supposed to be like as strict as possible with all the rulings. And then secondly, unfortunately, this is why I wanted to know if anyone knows, like, the frequency of when they do this. Because if it's some sort of scenario where every team is, like, self-testing every day, That's just going to increase the chances that one person has like a false positive or something. I'm sorry, it just is. Whereas if in the West, you're already doing like a mandated test once, like it just reduces the chances that someone randomly pops. Again, we're not talking about people who are actually ill. We're talking about there's a decent margin of people where if you just do enough of them, you can eventually have a positive, can't you, unfortunately?
And here's the thing, Thorin, that we should be extra worried about. T1 hasn't had any of these issues. And as we know, even if these players are vaccinated, it doesn't prevent Omicron breakthrough cases. It prevents them from being as bad, but it doesn't necessarily provide significant protection from you getting it. And so if the T1 players haven't gotten it yet in a country that is being absolutely ravaged right now, I'm just waiting for T1 to actually, have it themselves or somebody on the T1 staff. And then I guess playoffs just gets ruined. I guess that's it, unless they can change the policy.
Obviously, Monte means he is just anticipating that would be a terrible outcome that would ruin the playoffs. He doesn't mean I'm just waiting for T1 to get COVID and ruin the playoffs. He doesn't mean it like that. We all understand the phrasing, yes, of course.
Yeah, but you have to understand that, like, by not having it this variant recently, you're kind of like, well, given the current state of affairs, it's now making it more likely that they get it during playoffs than if they just got over it faster.
Yeah, unfortunately. Yeah, that's true, actually.
Yeah, it's bad. It's very bad. So, I mean, I really hope that we have a legitimate playoff here, but I don't see how that is going to be possible if they don't actually reinstitute policies where players can play remotely. And that is what absolutely should be done before the final week of competition.
By the way, even though it's miles and miles away, I hope somehow, Monte, we're in a world where you can choose by what method, but we just don't have this set of thresholds to go through to have a tournament. Because imagine Worlds, if someone like can't play a playoff game or something, it's genuinely going to ruin the narratives. If people don't know, even though this wasn't actually, I mean, it was partially it. We just had a giant event in Counter-Strike that effectively, the results almost certainly were altered by people testing positive and having to have stand-ins, and then also like a whole war scenario in the background of some of the teams. Like if you watch the games, it absolutely did sort of like sour the mood and ruin a bunch of the matches. So as much as we understand it's not the fault of the person test positive, we'll get all that, but the point is, like, in history, it's just going to ruin the moment, and so I hope by Worlds is all just gone and we're just back to a normal fucking tournament. By the way, I had a lot of other LCS talks, but I assume we're going to talk about with all.
Yeah, we'll talk about them with all.
Wait till he comes on. Want to see more cool, funny, interesting clips based on topics from my content? Well, subscribe to this channel then, or be a pleb and don't.